Fighting Through Podcast, episode 107. The book, Fighting Through from Dunkirk to Hamburg. Hello, I'm Paul Cheall, son of Bill Cheall, who fought in World War II, from Dunkirk in France right through to Hamburg in Germany. You may be used to hearing my voice as host of the Fighting Through podcast. It now gives me great pleasure to present my dad's entire book on my podcast feed, free to air. In return, all I ask is that you rate, review or share the book. And if you can spare a few dollars to help with the costs of running this show, then you can find links to buy me a coffee and Patreon on my donation tab on the website, fightingthroughpodcast.co.uk. For now, I'm leaving my traditional podcast episode format behind to cover just the book. There'll be a few extras thrown in which I retrieved from the cutting room floor when the book was produced. The printed and electronic versions of Dad's memoir are still for sale through publishers Pen and Sword and on Amazon with 5-star ratings and reviews from hundreds of people. So I hope you enjoy this audio version as much as they did. I'll see you again at the epilogue of Fighting Through from Dunkirk to Hamburg by my dad, Bill Cheall. Bye for now. Fighting Through from Dunkirk to Hamburg, a Green Howard's wartime memoir by Bill Cheall, edited by Paul Cheall. This story is dedicated to the Green Howards. Introduction by Bill Cheall. This is a true story of an ordinary soldier in the Green Howards during the Second World War. The story includes, amongst others, my experiences at Dunkirk, D-Day, a voyage on the Queen Mary, and being wounded in action. Many of the events described in this book have been taken from notes written soon after those events took place. The remainder has been compiled from my memoirs, which I set down only a few years after the war, while they were still fresh in my mind. More recently, I was given the inspiration to write everything down in book form, so that others may share some of the memories I have of that period in our lives. Writing my memoirs gave me the opportunity to relive the years from 1939 to 46. Looking back over the most traumatic and, dare I say, exciting time of my life causes me to delve very deeply into my thoughts and bring to the surface memories of things which happened so long ago that only a shadow remains. Others have gone with a passage of time. However, some of the happenings are still so vivid in my mind that I can recall almost every detail. What you're about to read is a true story of my service during the Second World War. Nothing is invented or imagined. It's a story of events as I saw and experienced them, and I will try to the best of my ability to describe vividly just how it was. At the beginning, little did I realize that my life would change forever as a result of my experience. Come with me on a journey of reminiscence about the 1939 to 45 Second World War. Bill Cheall, 439-0717, May 1994. Prologue. Looking for Bray Dunes. May 1940. Britain and her allies were at war with Germany. My B Company was part of the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, in France. Germany had invaded the country and was now putting pressure on the Allied forces. We had orders to retreat to the coast, to a place called Bray Dunes, near Dunkirk, in order to evacuate back to England. It seemed to have taken a very long time, but after some hours and 12 miles, we saw a cluster of buildings in the distance and added a little more haste to our walking. We were surprised that our destination seemed no larger than a seaside village. Eventually, we came upon one main road through the centre of the village, rather shabby and uncared for, which was understandable. It looked just like Dodge City, but it was great to us. It was Bray Dunes, and we were very pleased to have sight of it. But other troubles were very soon to descend upon us. We walked down the sand-blown main street, and at the end came to a small promenade overlooking the sea. Not a soul was in sight apart from our lads. We turned left and walked along this narrow promenade. It had a wooden rail along the seaward side, and there was a 6-foot drop to the beach. We stood and looked at the sea, which could mean our salvation. The other side of that water was England. Oh, that lovely sea, with England just on the other side. How simple. We walked to the end of the promenade, about 200 yards, which led onto deep soft sand, followed by huge 6-foot sandbanks. The sea was about 200 yards away from the high water mark, and both east and west the beach was very flat. The accompanying sight which greeted us will forever live in our memories. On the beach, running both ways, there were many tens of thousands of khaki-clad figures milling around for as far as we could see, but there was nowhere to go. And there were columns of soldiers, 3 deep, going out to sea, up to their shoulders, trying to get onto the small boats to take them to England. It was 30th of May, 1940. I don't know how, but we made our way to the water's edge and looked out to sea across to the horizon and saw the ships going to Dunkirk further along the coast. We then made our way back to the deep sand dunes in order to gain some protection from the bombing and strafing which was taking place. Many of the boys on the beach were in a sorry state. The Stuckers had just been over. One must remember that not all soldiers are hard-bitten individuals, and some of the younger lads showed great emotion. I saw young soldiers just standing, crying their hearts out, and others kneeling in the sand, praying. It's very easy to pass critical remarks about these boys, but we others knew the ordeal these weaker-willed boys were going through, and helped them as much as we could during their emotional and distressing ordeal, as medical help was a very scarce thing on the beaches. So much had been bottled up inside these young soldiers that at last the bubble had burst and it was uncontrollable. Dead soldiers and those badly wounded lay all over the place, and many of the wounded would die. It was tragic to see life ebbing away from young, healthy lads, and we could not do a thing about it. It was heartbreaking. What few stretcher-bearers there were always gave of their best. They were extraordinary. How does one quantify devotion to duty under the conditions which prevailed in those days? The folk at home could not possibly have any idea what their boys were going through. We joined this mass of tired and hungry lads. Amidst all this tragedy, the Stuckers would return, machine-gunning the full length of the thousands of men. They could not miss, and a swathe of dead and wounded would be left behind, Really, it was awful. Nobody can imagine what it's like to be bombed by a German Stuka. They came out of the sky, screaming straight down, then dropped their bombs and pulled up into the sky again. I don't know why we ran. It was just instincts, I suppose. Near the shoreline, one boy of about 20, not far from me, had his stomach ripped open, and he was fighting to live, asking for his mum and crying. A few of us went to him, but he was too bad for us to help. Blood was everywhere. That poor boy soon died out of pain to join his mates. It's the most dreadful experience to see a comrade killed in such a way. The near impossibility of getting back to England left many of us rather stunned, as it just did not look possible. Those remaining in our battalion stuck together among the dunes. We had had nothing to eat except hardtack biscuits and bully beef. We hadn't had a hot meal for God knows how long, and those of us who usually shaved looked really haggard. None of us could see any sign of the 23rd Divisional Assembly area, and nobody seemed to know what to do for the best. Then the planes came over again, causing more deaths. Only 20 yards from me, some boys had been hit by shrapnel, and one of them was in a serious condition. The medics were there, but he would not live. A sleepless night was ahead of us. There was no plan of action, and even the officers seemed to be showing signs of tension. At about midnight, we heard a plane coming, but it wasn't a bomber. It was dropping parachute flares, and suddenly it was as light as day and eerie and fluorescent. Towards Dunkirk there were dozens of fires caused by burning vehicles, and the flames from the burning oil storage tanks lit up the clouds. Very quickly the Stukas came over, doing their killing, flying the length of the beach, and we dug even deeper into the sand. Soldiers on the beach were running all over the place, but there was nowhere to go. I don't know why God was allowing this to happen. The morning eventually came, and we were very cold, hungry, and utterly miserable, but there was no let-up from our discomfort. I was beside Major Petch. I was his batman, and he said, "Come on, Cheall, I want to see if I can find someone in authority to give guidance to us." From our elevated positions amongst the sand dunes, we could see, more so, the thousands of soldiers on the beaches. Most of them at this early hour were lying around on the sand, certainly wondering what the day would bring. It would take a miracle for us all to be lifted off. I can't recall seeing any signs of despondency, though. After all, we were soldiers, even if we were somewhat dishevelled, and only showed natural tendencies to want to get out of the predicament we now found ourselves in. Oh, for a mess tin full of tea, and for most of the lads, a Woodbine cigarette. Around 1100 hours, it looked as though the officers on the beach were trying to organise the men. The Major and I went along the beach to try and find somebody with any news of what was happening about the evacuation. We'd walked about 1 mile when we met our divisional commander, Major General Herbert. He was collecting a column of our 23rd Division in order to proceed to Dunkirk to try and get on a boat, since there was no chance of us being evacuated if we stayed where we were. He told Major Petch to collect his company and join the column with utmost urgency. We hurried back to where our company was waiting to give them the news. In the distance, we could see what must be Dunkirk. The 5 miles walk there, tired as we were, seemed like 50 on the soft sand, which played havoc with tired legs. Ahead of us, I could see the oil tanks with black smoke and flames pouring from them after they'd been bombed. As we made our way along the beach, a fighter plane zoomed down to machine-gun the men. Many of us knelt down and fired our rifles at the planes, but they were useless. We could see ships out at sea making their way from Dunkirk to England, and we could also see the dive bombers after the ships. To our horror, many other ships had been sunk, their funnels and superstructures sticking out of the water. It was a ship's graveyard, and it looked dreadful. Eventually, our column reached the pier, or East Mole, as it was called, and we waited in a long queue until it was possible for us to board a ship. Really, it's almost unbelievable, but even when we were attacked by planes, we didn't move, in case we lost our place in the column. The Mole was a wooden jetty, only about 5 feet wide and 1,400 yards long. It was never supposed to have large ships berth alongside. Thousands of men had formed queues leading down to the sea and were in the water up to their shoulders, doing their utmost to get onto one of the small boats, which very often capsized. Beachmasters had a very difficult task keeping some semblance of order, but by and large the lads just waited patiently for their turn to come until the planes came over. Those in the water just ignored the bombs. Where could they run? And anyway, the sea absorbed a lot of the blast. There was always the hot-headed lad who thought he had more right to get away, but the officers only had to draw a revolver, and they calmed down and accepted the inevitable. In the prevailing mood of many of the men, it was common to see groups of soldiers kneeling down, being led by a padre in prayer. There, by the side of the jetty, a ship was waiting to be loaded with human cargo. We walked along the wooden pier, and back came the planes. It seemed never-ending, trying to bomb our ship, but without success. We walked along for about a half a mile to the ship we'd be boarding. Miraculously, the Mole was still intact, but there was a 6-foot gap in the planking where a bomb had gone through without exploding, and loose planks had been put across. Some boys, in their desperate hurry, chose to jump the gap with their full kit on. Luckily, none fell through into the water. Another 30 yards and we came to our ship. At the top end of a gangway stood an officer, counting soldiers as they went aboard. The ship was a ferry ship called the Lady of Man. How could I forget that name? How lucky we considered ourselves to be. Out of all those thousands of men, we were being given the opportunity to be evacuated. It was almost impossible for men of the same companies to stay together, but that was no consequence at a time like this. The ferry was fast becoming packed with grateful lads. The captain would know how many men the ship could carry, but God alone knows what would have happened had a bomb hit us. I was lucky enough to be on deck to see what was happening, and it must have been very claustrophobic down below deck. I kept my eyes on the nearest Carly float in case the worst happened. The fact that we'd managed to get on a boat was no guarantee that we would reach England, because the Luftwaffe was doing its utmost to prevent us. As the ship was filling up, a padre came and stood on a ladder, called for silence, and prayed for our deliverance to England. At last, packed like sardines, the ship started to tremble, and so very slowly we pulled away from the mole. It was 1800 hours, 31st of May 1940. Being a little taller than many of the others enabled me to have a panoramic view of the whole length of the beach. How many of those boys would get back to England, and how many would be killed or taken prisoner. The beach was as crowded as ever. Then suddenly I saw a German fighter plane skimming above them, firing cannons. It reminded me of a row of dominoes being knocked down from one end. The dense black smoke from the blazing oil storage tanks still reached far into the sky. There was another loaded ship about 1 mile ahead of us, and suddenly I heard the Stukas returning, diving almost vertically. I saw the bombs leaving one of the planes and was certain our time had come and that this was the end. My thoughts were mixed with prayer and despair as I prepared for what I thought was inevitable. How the heck did it all come to this? As the bombs came tumbling out of the sky towards us, my life flashed before me, and in an instant I relived every moment of my time since just before the start of the war, when life had seemed so good. End of introduction and prologue.